Hello everyone, welcome back into the studio. This week's video is going to be an interview I did about a year ago. This interview was for a school project and I put the video out on Patreon. It's been a year, so I figured I'd put it out here on YouTube as well. If you want to see tutorials and learn sculpture from me, you can visit my Patreon page. If you enjoy the content, hit the subscribe button and like the video, it really helps me out a lot. Okay, on to the video where we'll be talking about education, sculpture and the business of art while I do some work on my over life-size Chronos project in the background. Enjoy.
So I guess the first thing is just to introduce yourself. How long have you been sculpting for? And early on in that process, what was sculpting like for you? Think about resources, and how did you use them?
Yes, so I guess I can just fire off with, what is it called? Name and all that sort of stuff. So my name is Eirik Arnesen. I'm from Norway, Oslo, Norway, and I've been sculpting since around 2011. At the end of 2010, I was in college, in art college, and we had a project where it was essentially do something with the human body. That was kind of the theme, and it was very kind of open to interpretation. You did whatever you wanted, and I'd figured I tried painting, I tried some drawing, I've tried a bunch of different things this first semester, so I gave sculpture a shot at that point, and sculpted this little half-life size torso figure, and turned out. I mean, probably didn't turn out that well, but I had a lot of fun doing it, essentially, right? And one thing that I think kind of that worked really well for me, and probably why sculpture, what is it called? Like it spoke to me in a way, right? Because with drawing and painting, there's a lot of magic needing to happen, a lot of illusion needing to happen, and those things can be a little bit untransparent if you are to the uninitiated. And we weren't really being taught very much as far as technique goes. So it was kind of like just trial and error. But with sculpture, you get this kind of object in front of you pretty fast, and by the virtue of it being in real space or existing in real space, you already have form turning, you already have dimension to it. It doesn't appear flat usually, so you have all these things already happening for you, and that's always. I think that's why it seemed probably more successful to me than what it was, and that kind of gave me the impetus to chase after it a little bit more. I think just the fact that this first sculpture seemed to turn out as something, and that kind of sparked a little bit of fire, and then you go after it, and then you're kind of off to the races.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. I kind of relate in a way, at least in the past couple of years, where I was mainly focusing a lot on painting, and then the reintroduction of clay and working in 3 dimensions was something that it just felt more satisfying in a way, because you could, like what you're talking about, it presents itself in a different way that isn't very illusionary.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not entirely sure if it was necessarily ultimately I was having more success sculpting than I was having painting and
Yeah.
drawing, but it kind of, I don't know, there was a different feeling there that I got from it that
Hmm.
probably felt more successful than what it ultimately
Right.
was, and that's kind of why. I mean, I think that's kind of what you need, right? Like if
Mhm.
you get a few wins under your belt, then you're kind of good to go. You got a little bit of confidence. Now you're going after something, um, and I think that's how, like that. And every other project that sculpture kind of worked within that I could do at that school, I did. Um, but let me go back just like a little bit. So how I even kind of got into the arts at all. I was always like drawing and painting a lot when I was a kid. Maybe up until I was, let's say, 10, 11. I was always drawing, and nothing kind of like spectacular, just for fun, with no sort of consequence, no classes or anything like that. It was just like a fun thing that we did, me and my friends. And I think around maybe when we were 10 or 11, we started getting into Warhammer, and the Warhammer, like the tabletop game with the miniatures, and those you have to build and paint. And so that kind of took over from drawing and painting, was building miniatures, model airplanes, and stuff like that, and painting them. Uh, but then at some point you become a teenager, and that stops being cool, which it really did. And but I still kind of liked it. But I followed along with everyone else and kind of stopped doing that for a few years. And I think maybe when I was 17 or something, I was like, screw it, I'm done being cool. I'm just gonna do what I want to do. So I got back into it. Um, I did that for a few years, and that's kind of how I started getting into finding online resources. Um, at that time, you know, YouTube certainly was a thing, but there was mostly just like, if I remember correctly, I never watched like a YouTube tutorial on anything back then. It was mostly just like cat videos or people
Yeah,
getting hurt or stuff like that,
exactly.
which was a lot of fun, but you know, not very educational. So I found this website called Miniature Mentor, and I don't know if they're still around, but they had painting tutorials, and at some point they had like some sculpting tutorials because people obviously hand make these small miniatures, and I watched some of those sculpting tutorials and was kind of like, oh, that's cool, and started, you know, changing up my own miniatures, like adding hair and stuff like that. So I suppose that's kind of my first sculpting experience, really. And then that once I got into art college, that kind of transitioned into that first project, or deciding to even try that first project.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess yeah, that's what I was curious about is like what was the that initial spark? What were those early influences? So yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah,
Um,
so it's definitely like a little bit, I suppose, untraditional. It was those Warhammer miniatures, along with like watching documentaries about how Lord of the Rings was made and realizing that somebody like sculpted all these monsters and stuff. That was
hmm,
kind of the thing that I wanted to do for quite a while. I was a little bit kind of torn between what world to enter. Did I want to pursue kind of figurative art and kind of fine art, or did I want to go after like the concept art and science fiction stuff? But I always really enjoyed working with clay and like working with my hands and making real objects in the real world, and the whole film industry and all that concept stuff. That was kind of number one. Hollywood is really far from Norway, so that was partially it. It seemed really impossible to do, and also they were kind of at the time transitioning a lot into doing so much more digital stuff, and I just wasn't really interested in that. I was much more interested in working with my hands, working with clay. That was kind of where I was having my fun. So
right.
that's so then that's how I decided to kind of follow down the fine art path instead of a lot of the initial influences.
Hmm. So yeah, as you like fell into that more fine arts sort of practice, would you say your influences changed a lot during that time, like to more maybe something more like classical sculpture or just like anything like that?
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. Once you kind of, so that's actually a really good segue into what kind of happened next. So once I finished high school, I was doing all this miniature painting and stuff and having a lot of fun, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And artist at the time wasn't really even something that I thought was like a possible thing that people did. I didn't really, I guess, I hadn't, I mean, I knew that people were artists, but it didn't seem like something that you could do unless you were somehow, I don't know, magically talented or something like that. So it wasn't really something that I was even considering. And I had no idea what to do. And in Norway, you need to, in order to apply or to do any university course, you need, I think it's, well, it used to be at least one semester of classes at the beginning of your university time doing ethics and philosophy. So it's kind of like a prep course essentially. Uh, I suppose to I guess the idea is to make the 18-year-old kind of a little bit more aware of the world, I suppose, and how ideas have propagated through time and all these sorts of things, and how to be an ethical and decent human being.
Hmm.
Since I mean, universities at some point were meant for were meant for more like research purposes, right? Eventually, that's where you ended up afterwards. So I figured, okay, well, I'm probably going to go to college, so I'll take this prep course. And you could take these prep courses, you could take them at the university, but there's also a lot of kind of I don't even know how to describe this, but well, essentially, there's small private schools that have set up um, the opportunity for people to take these um, prep courses in foreign lands, in foreign countries. So a lot of people will go to like Bali, for example, and surf and get drunk and you know perhaps have a lot more adventure and a little bit less school.
Hmm.
So you could do this, and I figured, okay, well, let me go to Rome because they had these classes in Rome, and so I went there. That was in 2010, and I lived for 6 months in Rome, in Italy, and that's where I kind of, well, it was very hard not to be exposed, seriously exposed to the classics and the fine art there. And I remember really vividly, like the first time when and I'm getting like goosebumps even talking about it. I lived right outside Piazza del Popolo, which is one of the old kind of gates that you have to go into to get into the old kind of city center of Rome, the historical city centers. I lived right outside there, and there's a church by Piazza del Popolo, like next to the gate, on the inside of the gate. And I can't remember the name of it, but it's probably something like Chiesa del Popolo or something del Popolo anyway. So I'm wandering around Rome, checking out the scenery and walking in there one day. And in one of the, next to the altar there's like a little kind of alcove with three walls, and there's two Caravaggio paintings there. Really highly rendered. I don't remember the name of them, but one of them is of, I think it might be Saint Andrew's, who's getting like crucified upside down. So he's like laying backwards on the cross, and the cross is being lifted up, and he's kind of looking out at you, screaming, which is kind of horrifying. But when I saw that, and it's so well like realistically painted, I was like, okay, this is, and this is how you're. This is a good thing that you're a total idiot when you're, or total ignorant as to what it takes to do something, to paint something like that when you're 18 years old, probably, or, well, I guess I was 19, but so I was like, yeah, that's what I want to do, you know, which seems pretty dumb in retrospect to look at a painting like that and be like, yeah, I think I'll do that. That looks cool. If people did that, then I can probably do that. Not really knowing that it's not the easiest thing in the world to do. But that was kind of the first time when I was like, oh shit, this is legit. People can do this. People have done this. I'm gonna do this. And so when I got back to Norway, I applied for art college and started that.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've had a similar experience where like this naivety of being young, and you see this amazing artwork, and then it's like, oh yeah, that's the one. That's what I'm gonna do.
Yeah, I think you need that though. I think you need
Yeah,
that a little bit. Like if you knew what it took, I think too many people would quit, man. Like you
exactly.
you just you just got to be kind of yeah, that looks cool. I'll do that. And then you go after it, and then,
Hmm.
you get there eventually, but or maybe not, but at least you get partially there, hopefully.
Hmm.
Uh, but I think if you like knew what that took, man, it
Right.
would be heartbreaking. You wouldn't try even, I think so.
Yeah,
It's good
I
to have that, I think, in
definitely
the beginning
agree.
at least.
Hmm. So yeah, do you want to kind of touch on like some of your education, like as like you just said you applied to art college. Do you want to like talk about what the first kind of semesters, trimesters were like there?
Yeah, so that art college was in Norway, and that's where I kind of gave sculpture my first shot. And the way that art college was set up was there's like a few kind of well, I mean they're kind of highly regarded in the art world, I suppose. Uh, Colleges in Norway, and this is not one of them. This is just like a random college that has a bunch of classes for a bunch of different things, and they're probably more known for being a place where teachers get educated and nurses get educated, and physiotherapists get educated. So it's more kind of a highly regarded school for that compared to the art program that they had. I don't even know if they have it anymore, but at the time at least that was kind of like, yeah, yeah, you guys are over there doing your own thing. You get a bachelor, but it doesn't really mean anything. And they didn't really teach you very much either. Ultimately, it was a lot more like you could choose two paths, and you can really tell where kind of the speciality of the teachers were when you saw those two paths. It was like do whatever you want, general arts, and then it was fashion design. And their fashion design classes were really good, and people like they graduated from there and did well for themselves doing fashion design. And they were taught like a lot because they had teachers who had been part of that, worked in that world. But I chose the like the general art side, and it was mostly just here's a 2-month assignment. Here's a theme that we are supposed to work within. Make sure you have like a write up about it, an essay about what you've done at the end, and good luck. Work hard. Sometimes they had a teacher who knew whatever the student was doing, and in my case, they didn't. So I just kind of like fumbled around with with sculpture once I started doing that, I just kept fumbling around with sculpture and looking for resources here or there. Um, I found quite a few resources from there's this two websites in particular that I used quite a bit. One called the Stan Winston School, which is definitely more catered towards kind of creating special effects and educating people on how that's done. But there's obviously a lot of sculpture in that as well, and mold making as well. So I learned a lot there, and also the Gnomon Workshop was a place where I, like bought video tutorials essentially and watched them. And so that was kind of like the initial education, was just me kind of scratching for anything and scratching and clawing for any sort of information that I could find, and just practicing, just sculpting as often as I could, and usually small scale in oil-based clay, because there wasn't really facilities, or oil-based clay is quite forgiving when it comes to like having to sculpt in like your dorm bedroom essentially for the most part, or in like a small desk. And so there was like a few books in there, but for the most part, the books that you can find on sculpture, well, that I was able to find at the time, they were a little bit kind of, they were beyond me. You know what I mean? It was there's one by Lanteri, but what he talks about is you almost need to be kind of an educated sculptor in order to, at least I didn't quite understand what was going on in that book. But so that was essentially like the first 3 years of college, where I just I just sculpted, and it was like around sixth scale oil-based clay figures, and I just sculpted at every opportunity I had, and that was pretty much it. Just fumbling.
Yeah. I think a lot of art students, at least in America, like what I've been exposed to, also have this like very serious period of fumbling around in the beginning. And because it's, for me at least, it's only my third year, and like now is the time where I'm starting to focus.
Hmm.
So yeah, I guess, yeah, I'm very interested in like the differences between like American colleges versus European colleges. So I'm glad you touched on that a little bit.
I imagine that, like, when it comes to the art, and I imagine it's probably fairly like somewhat similar. Of course, I think you're gonna like run into a lot of differences depending on like what school and what teachers you have, right? Because there were
Hmm.
teachers at this art college that I went to who had a lot of technical experience within like certain fields, but there was just nobody who had any technical experience within sculpture. And so that essentially meant that I just had to figure it out on my own, which was a lot of fun. I got to make uh, got to make a lot of mistakes. I probably like almost provided brain damage for the entire class by thinking that epoxy resin was the same as like polyurethane resin, and
Mm,
pouring like deep casts with that. And of course, epoxy resin, or the one that I was using, was meant to be like brushed on the outside of a boat or something, so it boiled up and
mm.
gassed off, and it was a whole scene. But yeah,
At
it was
least
a
you
lot
learned.
of lot of fumbling and like failing in the beginning. But um, I don't know. I mean, I look back. It was fun. I do look back quite fondly on that, well, on the sculpture aspect of that. It's definitely depressing to a certain extent to kind of just to be in that place and just kind of fumbling, knowing that there's definitely more out there that I don't know, but I don't even know where to look for it.
Hmm.
Um, but it was also a little bit, I think, like romantic in that I had a side job. I did sports as well, so I think it was like the evenings that I had time to sculpt was like Tuesdays. So on Tuesdays I'm gonna get home from school at like 5, and I'm just gonna spend until 11 o'clock at night or wherever, just to myself sculpting in my room. And it was a good time for that. And I think also when you don't know what you don't know, of course. So the fact that there wasn't a lot of teaching made it very free. And ultimately, the fact that I had sculpted a lot before I even went to the Florence Academy, and went on with like a little bit more serious education, or more like drilled down education. That was a big bonus, I think, and it definitely kind of expedited a lot of things that I think a lot of our students at the Florence Academy end up having issues with, because I had quite a bit of experience doing it on my own.
Right. Could you like elaborate on that a little bit? Like what sort of like, I guess since you're a professor there now, yes. Like could you elaborate on like the sort of like struggle that you're noticing that you just touch on a little bit?
Well, there's things like I think that they're very very typical things, like not quite having a full grasp of, for example, mold making. Now, I certainly
Mm.
didn't when I started, not like a complete grasp, but I had made molds. Like I made molds in my parents' basement, and sometimes that went horribly wrong. But that was just part of the game, right? You try your best. I remember one time I made like a matrix mold and I poured silicone into it, and because I hadn't clamped down the plaster, the whole like plaster shell just like lifted up, and I dropped like $200 worth of silicone on the floor. That was great. But that kind of that trial and error. If that hasn't happened, you haven't really experienced a lot of those things. So we get students who don't know how to mix plaster, for example, and that's not a
Mm.
big deal. You teach them how to mix plaster, and that's fine. But I already had a lot of those experience. I had done that on my own, and like anatomy, for example, a lot of people won't have a decent grasp of anatomy, and if you don't have that, sculpture can be obviously quite tricky. You don't need to be like a doctor or anything like that and know every single muscle, but it's nice if you can tell the difference between bone and muscle, for example. So we run into issues with that, which we try to solve, and also just the ability to like manipulate the material. If you haven't sculpted a lot, like your ability to manipulate the material is going to inhibit how well you are able to represent your subject. And that does get in the way for people. So, and also just kind of knowing how a human figure is put together, just from the experience of having gone through it multiple times. Even though my first sculptures that I made in Norway, weren't necessarily even that good, but just having gone through that experience and figuring out how this section worked, and maybe I don't know how that section worked, but at least I have a firm grasp of this thing and that thing. So there's a lot of these sorts of things that I think, and also this is an important one, knowing that you even like to sculpt, right?
Hmm.
Sometimes I think people get a little bit attached to the idea of what it means, uh, but I already knew what it meant to attempt to be a sculptor, right? And so I knew that that's what I wanted to do. And I think sometimes people come to school and they don't really know what sculpture is. They don't really know what it means to do this. They don't know about the hard hours and sometimes like messy materials and all these sorts of things. So
Hmm.
I think that kind of gave me like a decent leg up. Now I think you'll find people who will argue that there's two sides to that coin, and I do agree with that, right? Because I also showed up uh, thinking that I knew more than I did, and that
Mm.
kind of backfired a few times in the beginning for sure. So sometimes it's probably good to be a blank slate as well.
Hmm. Yeah. So, do you want to like talk a little bit about those skills that you're seeing in other students now? Like when you were first introduced to the Florence Academy, did you like see any major shifts in your skills, or like just through these experiences of learning? And like, how were those shaped by your education?
Right. So I I after I got my bachelor in the arts in college, like this professional art career didn't really materialize. So like right off the rip as I thought it would, which that's probably not so rare, and I wasn't really shocked by that. But I needed a way to make money, so what I did then was I did a year of teachers education in Norway, which you can do. You can do like a year learning what it means to be a teacher, like the what's it called? Pedagogy or something like that. I
Hmm.
don't know exactly the word in English. Anyway, like the science of teaching, let's call it. And so you get taught that, and then you can take your bachelor and apply that teaching. So I did that, and while there, I kind of realized that teaching kids, high school students that didn't really want to be in your art class, they were more interested in like smoking cigarettes or whatever. I wasn't really like I was having a bit of a hard time doing that.
Hmm.
And also I was having a hard time kind of, high school is a tough place for people. So a lot of times you have to kind of be a little bit more than just the guy who teaches people how to make art essentially. And I wasn't and while, all power to the people who are capable of doing that and are willing to do that and enjoy doing that, but that wasn't really for me. So I kind of took a shot in the dark, applied for the Florence Academy of Art, um, got in, and went to Florence. and that was 2014. So I was 24 years old when I went, and it was pretty much like when I started. I like the first day, I I instantly knew that okay, this was a good decision because I had previously done like an exchange student semester in Wales, um, and when I got there, it was kind of the same situation as it was at home in Norway, where there was no teachers or anything like that, and so that was a really bad experience. And I knew instantly when I got to Florence, like, okay, this was probably a good decision. This is looking like on the up and up. Uh, so as far as process changing or skills and technique changing, a lot changed pretty much right off the rip because I had developed like a way of doing things, you know, and it was based a lot on not visual observation because I didn't really know that you could hire a model and look at them while you sculpt it and represent them faithfully, or even, you know, look at a photograph and represent it faithfully. I had no kind of idea of what that even meant. So once that's instantly what they started teaching was like a few of the core concepts, uh, which is observing on equal terms, which essentially means if I want to sculpt you, I'm not going to look at the back of your head while I'm attempting to sculpt the front. And I'm not going to look at the 3/4 view while I'm attempting to figure out what happens from the front. I'm going to look at the front and sculpt the front, which makes a lot of sense to pretty much everyone once you say it. But to me, it was kind of like I had no
Yeah.
idea this was possible. You know, I had gotten like cool pictures of some person or um, like a sculpture or whatever from 3/4 view, and I just gone at it as best as I could, not even considering the fact that maybe I should just like find good photographs and sculpt from that, from the point of view of the photograph or from the reference or whatever. So instantly, I had to kind of, I mean, I probably, let's say that instantly I should have made adjustments to my technique and process, but that kind of like a lot of the things that they taught just like went over my head in the beginning. Uh, so it took like probably like a year and a half almost of studying there until I started feeling like I kind of understood what I needed to do. And it probably wasn't until like my third year where I was able to put those concepts and techniques and processes like jot them down in the clay so that I actually ended up with something that looked decent, you know. So it took a really really long time, and it's like an extremely involved process. So it's kind of hard to say exactly what changed, but let's just say that like pretty much my entire method of sculpting uh, had to be rearranged and shifted quite a bit,
Mhm.
but for the better, I think, for the better.
Yeah, definitely. I think that that must come from just like time as a whole. I think about that a lot in my own practice about how we start at a certain point, right? Of like maybe it's naive, maybe it's like we have a method of doing something like you were talking about, and then
Hmm.
provided opportunities and experience, like being put in a situation where you're forced to like reconsider. I think that's like a period of like growth for a lot
Yeah,
of people.
yeah.
Um, Go ahead.
So yeah, sorry. So one of the things that I think we at the Florence Academy of Art, like, well, I can only speak for the sculpture program, but I know that this is true for the painting and drawing program as well. One of the things that's the strength of the entire program is that we don't teach like sculpture, you know? We teach a technique, a process of sculpture. So you kind of have to, I wouldn't say fall in line, that sounds a little bit harsh, but you have to kind of you have to well, you have to fall in line a little bit with what we are teaching at the time, what they were teaching to me, so that there is even a conversation that can be had, really. And you know, one of the like I was very hesitant to do that, but that was probably like ego getting in the way, thinking that I knew better. But it's a time tested, and it's a time tested and also tested on like hundreds of students, and you know, once you kind of accept that, you can tell that you can see that there's a lot of wiggle room within the process that we do teach, and there's a lot of kind of room for doing your own thing as well. But it's just if there's no common language essentially
Mhm.
of sculpting, it becomes very difficult to talk about sculpture. Then we're just kind of pointing out inaccuracies, you know. And since we work from life, and accuracy is a big part of what we're trying to kind of, like, as the end goal, accuracy is a big deal for us. And it's not necessarily to say that accuracy is the end all and be all of sculpture, but again, you need kind of a measuring stick to measure success. And if that measuring stick is subjective, uh, that's a problem. So, and that's fine in like the art world, but in a school setting, that's a little bit of a problem. So, the process is kind of, it really deals with control and accuracy as kind of the end result, or the end goal, if you will. And that certainly takes a lot of time for people to kind of attain.
Hmm. That makes me wonder, did you ever have critique settings during like classes there? Like, were you able to discuss things like accuracy, like representation, that kind of thing?
Oh, you mean discuss the validity of it, let's say,
Uh, I guess
or
more so
just like
like
in your own work?
just like each person, like as a hypothetical, presents their work, and then
Hmm.
the larger group discusses like the successes or like things that could be improved.
Right. So, um, okay. So maybe I should talk, like, before I kind of get into that. Maybe I should talk a little bit about how, like, the setup works, essentially, like how each day kind of works. So there's classes, and then I'll get to answering your question.
Yeah, yeah.
So essentially, 5 days a week, there's classes from 9 to 4 with an hour lunch break. So 3 hours in the sculpting program, 3 hours of drawing, 3 hours of sculpting. Um, and then there's evening classes. So those evening classes are anatomy lectures. That's 2 hours one evening. Then there's 2 evening drawings where you do pencil drawing, and that's 2 hours, 2 evenings. Then there's art history lecture, which is kind of an informal art history lecture on Friday, where everyone kind of gets together and hangs out, and one of the teachers do a lecture, and sometimes there are guest lecturers. And then in addition to that, there's an crochet program that you can do as well, but that's like an extra voluntary. So there's a lot of classes. Let's put it that way. Most days you're working from like 9 to 7, which gets pretty rough, especially until you get into the habit of it and get used to it. And so every day you will, well, there's a bit of a generalization, but every day you'll come in, you'll have your assigned project. That depends on what point you're in the program. Projects obviously get more complex as the program goes along. And each day you'll get a critique from a teacher. Sometimes two, usually you'll get one. And the teacher will come in and they'll look at your work and they'll talk about essentially what needs to happen, the problems that you're going through, the problems that you're facing, the excuse me, the issues that you're having as far as understanding process and concepts. And some generalized fix this, fix that as well from time to time, though we try to avoid that as much as possible so that the students are independent, or as independent, and the decision making is pretty much their own in that sense. And that those critiques are around probably 5 to 10 minutes uh, for each person. But for the most part, it is essentially studio practice. Now, what you mentioned about everybody kind of putting their work together and having a look at it, sometimes a teacher will do that if there's a common theme for the issues that they are seeing. A lot of times we do it at the beginning of of um, of a project, usually in form of like a demo. We'll talk through whatever concepts and things that we are looking to teach with this project. Each project has a certain set of objectives that we're looking for the students to accomplish. So it's not like we're asking them to create perfect artwork right off the rip. We're asking them to, okay, this is what this little tiny part of the process is what we're looking to see if you are understanding and doing well this time around. Uh, Otherwise, I think people get a little bit overwhelmed. There's like too much. So that's pretty much how it kind of tends to pan out. And Yeah, sometimes depending on the teacher, they will put all the work together and we will discuss the differences and things like this. But that's not something that's kind of a core part of the program. Let's say it's
Mhm.
mostly going to be individual critiques.
I see. Yeah, so I asked that because in my program of study, we have it structured where we have like our regular classes throughout the week, and then projects are assigned, and we have, say, like 2 weeks to complete. And
Hmm.
then from there is when the whole class comes back together and we kind of talk through the concepts, the process of the artist that's presenting,
Hmm.
and deliver critique that way.
Okay.
So that difference is very interesting to me. Although like I see a commonality of like the this very like short individual like 5 to 10 minute thing. That's interesting to me. Um,
Yeah. So like there's a lot of things that there's always a lot of things that could be done better and stuff like this. Sorry about the background here. We
no,
got
it's
some
okay.
action in the background. So yeah, there's always things that probably can be adjusted and improved. And I think the one of the things that has been done a little bit in the past, and probably we should do more actually, is have the students like critique each other's work. But there's always some issues that can potentially arise with that as well. But I think that's like a good way to certainly to teach the second you get to kind of you get when you look at your own work, it's very hard to get distance from it. So it's a little bit more difficult to critique it. But when you look at somebody else's work, like it's a lot easier to, I think, see the faults, the issues, and then attempt to help that person correct those. So that's something that we have done from time to time, but for the most part, it is individualized critiques with group demos from time to time.
I see. So to me, it kind of sounds like a lot of the delivery of education or delivery of knowledge just deals a lot with the process. And this is going to kind of segue into your own artwork.
Hmm.
Is there much to do with sort of the concepts behind the actual artwork itself?
So for my own personal work, um, the process, the technique, all that is still present, and I think that's a bit of a choice, right? Like the Florence Academy is not a place too much anyway, until maybe towards the end of the program, where people are taught how to make art, how to they're taught technique. They're taught like a solid process, and once they have that, it's a little bit up to them what you do with it. Um, you know, and there's not necessarily because I think there are some things in art which can be quantified, which can be subjectively judged. No, sorry, not subjectively judged, objectively judged rather. And those are kind of the things that we focus on until we get into some of the more advanced third year projects where other things get more artistic things gets talked about a little bit. For my own work, I try to like I pick things. Usually there has to be something that holds my interest. That's usually the concept. So if there's something that I feel is important to say, now that can sometimes be like developed over the course of the sculpture itself. So sometimes I will simply have sort of an image in my mind that I think looks good, or I'll see an artwork or a photograph or something just in real life walking around, and that will give me kind of inspiration for a sculpture. So I have to have some sort of, well, not necessarily have to, but I like to have some sort of concept that holds my interest, that I can kind of research and consider while working. I don't necessarily think you need to have that, but for me that's an important part of it. But i'm not i'm I'm probably, just because of my interest in the type of artwork that I like to make, like the technique and the process is just it's never going to take a backseat to the concept. Let's put it that way.
Mhm.
But I mean, I think that turns into, again, like an individual choice, which each person chooses what they want to be on that scale where they would like to.
Mhm.
But my choice of subject, uh, or concept for that matter, is like I'm a simple man. It's not so advanced. Like I read a book, there's a passage that I think sounds like it would look cool on film or as an image, and then I try to kind of construct that myself. So it's
Mhm.
pretty simple.
Yeah, that I like that a lot. I think just reflecting on my own experience with school, they very much enforced like this idea of thinking through the concept and every single like possible connection that could be made to like what you're representing. Where I think that can be in a way a little bit like almost disheartening or like too much to think about. So the simplicity that you bring up is something that like I can definitely appreciate that a lot. Um,
So you know, there's certainly it's certainly a good thing to kind of consider a lot of the let's call them like the threads that come out of your initial concept and ideas, but there is like there's going to be like the interpretation of anyone's artwork is, unless you literally like post like a written write up that people are supposed to read, which kind of defeats the purpose of it being called the visual arts anyway, in my eyes at least, and each to his own there, of course. But also, each person who watches somebody else's artwork are going to get something different out of it. You know what I mean? And sometimes that doesn't even have to be something like super profound. And so attempting to control that a little bit like too carefully can get a, you know, it's not that it's bad, but I think it can kind of be a little bit of a wasted effort from time to time. You know, it's like a title obviously really helps in communicating what you're after or the story that you're after telling, but people are going to get different things out of it. And of course, you know, I think this is kind of probably a little bit typical of like art college, and frankly like Western education system in general, is that we have to like, unless you can kind of argue for what you're making, uh, I mean, not to call anyone out or anything like that, but unless you can kind of argue for what you're making, then like it doesn't have any validity to it. It seems, which I think is like it's a little bit faulty. You know, it's called a visual art. If you wanted to, if you wanted to write philosophy about what you were making, you'd be something else. You'd be a philosopher, and you know, in my eyes, it's good to think about it. It's good to understand what it is that you're making and having like, you know, gone through the gamut of what the idea and concept is about. But I think it's also important not to kind of exhaust that too much. You know, a lot of times, at least I find that what I'm trying to say, especially when I start saying it, you know, when I start making a sculpture, like what I think I'm trying to say at the beginning is not what I end up thinking about the subject at the end. So it's a little bit of a journey in that fashion.
mhm.
I don't think that's too bad at all. It just means that, you know, you're evolving, or maybe the interpretation you had at the beginning was maybe a little bit misplaced, maybe a little bit maybe you ended up in a different place after kind of having thought about it a little bit more. Uh, there was this I don't remember who said it, but I'm sure it's been said by quite a few people that, you know, the like being a visual artist is essentially saying the things that cannot be said at the time. So you're creating something that says something that no one is capable of saying, and it's been distilled into this very kind of obviously visual thing that people can take in with a glance. While if you had to write it down, it would, you know, it'd be like a long process to take it in essentially. But here you have this very distilled version of it that is certainly not as closed off as a book has the potential to be, or an essay or whatever, right? So, and a lot of times I think we like visual artists operate in that space. They're saying the things that should be said, that needs to be said, but almost before they're being said, like actually being said, if
Mhm.
that makes any sense.
Yeah, I see. I guess that can kind of like redirect into how you're thinking about like representation with the human body. So, for example, like if you have a method behind choosing a model, a pose, the scale, like that kind of thing, like thinking through like that initial concept as you begin a artwork.
Right. So, um, a lot of times I will have, as I mentioned, I will usually have kind of some sort of visual idea in my head of what I want to make, right? And then that kind of obviously slowly morphs over time. There's a few different ways that that kind of I morph that and narrow that down into what the eventual sculpture will be. So in the beginning, it can be something really simple. Passage from a book. I want to create an image of this. I don't really know how to do that, so I'll write down essentially kind of the broad idea, but I'm not really sure what this is going to be yet. So I'll just sit on it. You know, it doesn't have to be represented right away. Then something else comes up. An example that I think is quite clear is and this is a sculpture that I've made that I'm kind of partially of the on the path of. So I think this is a good example. There's this passage in the Divine Comedy, Dante's Divine Comedy, when they're in hell in the Inferno section. They meet Dante and Virgil meets the soothsayers, people who have been fortune tellers in life. Essentially, according to I guess Christian faith and tradition at the time. I don't know how that has changed, but at least at the time, that was considered a sin. Lying to people essentially. But what's that was considered? Reading tarot cards, what are they called? The lines in your hand, whatever, telling you how things were going to go based on faulty methods, and so they ended up in hell, and they were forced to have their heads. Well, in the book, they're forced to have their heads and their feet turned backwards and kind of like wander through this section of hell, not really knowing where they're going, right? So they're kind of fumbling. I don't know where I'm going because I'm looking backwards. That was their punishment. Pretty bad stuff. And I read this and I was like, oh man, that's an epic image. Uh, and I was looking through, looking for different artworks that were, uh, there's a lot of people who have represented work or the story of Dante's Inferno in quite in glorious fashion. Let's say there's a lot of good work out there based on this book, but I couldn't really find anything with the soothsayers. So I was like, okay, well, whatever. I'll table this idea and I'll come up with something eventually. And eventually, I stumbled across this image of a Polish concept sculptor who does stuff for video games and stuff, and he had made this little like tiny uh, zombie head for Halloween in Super Sculpey, and the head was turned backwards, like the zombie had broken its neck and then been awakened, right? So the head was turned backwards, and the anatomy of the neck was like twisted around, and it was very realistically sculpted. And I was like, okay, got it. Now I know what I need to do, right? Now I have like a visual image in mind. So um, at that point, I have like a visual image that I kind of know what direction I need to go in. I know what the concept is. Um, what am I trying to say? I don't think I'm really need to try to say anything. You know what I mean? I don't know. Uh, it's essentially just like a representation or a visualization of a story. And at that point, I make maquettes. That's usually how I go about doing it. So I'll make some small scale figures in oil-based clay to kind of play around with composition and stuff. And I will stay in that stage doing maquettes until I find one that I like, essentially. And these maquettes are very much the same way that I started sculpting back home in Norway, like years and years and years ago. So I have a lot of fun doing them. They're low risk. I don't care about, like, I care about it being like semi-human looking, but I kind of like proportion is just like based on some generalized ideas of a proportion. The anatomy is like, it doesn't really matter if it's exactly right. Surface doesn't matter. Like none of it really matters too much. And they're like 6 hour sketches. Uh, and so I'll do those until I find one that I really like. And once I find one that I like, maybe I'll do another one just to kind of refine the idea at that point a little bit, just so I have a bit of a clearer idea in mind before I commit. Because usually when I start doing some like a larger project, we're talking like at least like a 6 month like timetable. Sometimes we're talking year, sometimes we're talking years. So if I know I'm going to spend that amount of time on something, it better be like something that I know is decent, uh, or at least have like a semi-decent concept of what I'm doing. And more often than not, I like to work in a scale that's 3/4 scale and upwards. And so that's a little bit unforgiving in terms of making adjustments on the fly. It's a little bit too large to essentially make good adjustments on the fly. In terms of like picking a scale, I that's that one's I just kind of go based off of feeling. Like what do I want to do at this point? Um, Now I'm in a very fortunate position in that I have a job teaching sculpture, and that kind of pays the bills. So I don't really need to consider, can I sell this to people? What's the best scale for selling this to people? How do I create something here that appeals to the most amount of people? So I kind of get to not consider that, which is a very privileged and lucky position to be in. Um, so if I had to do that, I'd probably make some different uh, decisions based on scale. But for the most part, I'll just pick a scale that I like. And
Mhm.
sometimes a project, it feels like a project needs, like I'm doing this really big sculpture now. And when at the beginning of that project, I was like, yeah, I wanted to set a new challenge for myself. I've done life size 3/4. Let me do bigger than life size this time and kind of see what I can do there. So sometimes that's the reason too. Like this project would be cool if it was massive and kind of towering over you. that would be neat because that kind of fits with the narrative of the project, essentially. Like it fits with the idea that this is supposed to be something like dominating and terrifying.
Mhm.
And it's not really that terrifying if it's this big. Then it's kind of cute, which
Right.
doesn't really do the thing that I wanted to do.
Mhm.
So the scale thing is yeah, that's just almost based off of, I don't even know. There's no like criteria there. It's almost based off of feel. What do I want to do? Do I want to set a new challenge for myself? What would be fun to do? And what's like manageable, So
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. And I'm curious how you're thinking about like the human body in relationship to that, because obviously there's like a million possibilities how to represent a single story, whether like with different like levels of abstraction. So I'm curious, like, how are you thinking about the human body in terms of like representing these ideas, these stories?
right. So one thing that I think is really kind of unique with the human body, which is why I kind of choose it as my subject, essentially, and kind of the vehicle, let's call it. Um, it's because it's universal. It's never going to go out of fashion, and we can dig up Greek sculptures, find them at the bottom of the sea, Greek bronzes, 2,000 to 3,000 years old, and we instantly connect to them. So that's why I choose the human body. Now, in terms of like how to represent the human body, for me, it's I want to represent something that looks and feels real. So usually that means a lot of times working from life when that's an opportunity, or partially working from life, or from real life reference at least, just to kind of get the fidelity and the organic kind of randomness almost that is present in life. Um, so I don't you and sometimes I make decisions. For example, like I want this figure to appear a touch more elegant, so I'll make the legs a little bit longer, or I want to accentuate. I made a sculpture with like extended arms, so I want to accentuate the extension of the arm. So I'll stretch the arm out like an extra centimeter or so. It makes it like slightly out of proportion, but without it being kind of absurd, let's say.
Hmm.
Or or I want to accentuate this kind of the movement that this figure has, so I'll make the gesture slightly stronger, or the anatomy more subdued, or more intense. But again, for the most part, like I'm fairly simple when it comes to these things. Like, well, the what is it called? The thought process is somewhat simple, not necessarily the execution, of course, but I don't have sort of major abstractions that I'm looking for, um, or anything like that. So I'm not really kind of I'm not often enough. I'm not thinking too much about how to kind of shift and change things when it comes to the models that I work with. Sometimes, but kind of, let's call it, within a very narrow window.
Yeah.
I'm not doing a lot of extreme stuff in that sense. It's mostly uh, tensing up the anatomy sometimes, making it pop a little bit more, giving certain parts a little bit more volume, pushing gesture ever so slightly. Um, but for the most part, I'm looking to do my best to represent the figure, the human body, as it is, or in as an organic and naturalistic way as I'm like capable of doing, at least.
Hmm.
And you know, again, I think in when it comes to this question, I think each to his own for sure. But for me, I've always felt that if whatever I'm looking at, the more real it feels, the more the more I'm kind of capable of connecting with it, the more I'm kind of willing to give myself to whatever it is that I'm looking at. But having said that, that's not entirely true either, because there certainly are like realistic, like some 19th century realistic sculpture that doesn't quite do it for me in the same way that some of Michelangelo's work does, right? Uh, so I think there's definitely like a broad spectrum there that you can fall wherever you kind of want to in many ways. But
Hmm.
I want to create things that both look and feel real. They don't necessarily have to be, but that's kind of the goal that I'm aiming for.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's interesting that you bring up like 19th century sculptors versus like Michelangelo, for example. Just thinking about like their influence in terms of like what they're representing. That's very fascinating to me. It makes me think of you're talking about some of these like little refinements you're making to gesture and volume and stuff like that. That reminds me a lot about some of the sculptures that I've studied a little bit on the Campanile in
Hmm.
Florence, like some of Donatello's work. These like the optical refinements he makes to present it from a further distance and it's still legible, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um,
So yeah, sure. That's what is it called? A lot of those things turn into kind of visual tricks, which are really cool, and but a lot of those things they are kind of what is it called? Obviously, Donatello knew where the work was going to be. He didn't kind of make it for himself in the studio, right? Well, he probably made it in the studio, but probably not. He probably knew very clearly he had a commission. He knew where it was going to be. I mean, he was from Florence. I assume that, for example, well, I know that when they did stuff for Or San Michele, which is a church here in Florence, he made some, well, they made some sculptures on the in the niches of it, around it, but also some reliefs. And he knew, obviously, he knew, for example, the direction of the sun that was going to shine the light on this relief. And so he sculpted it to be placed right there. So a lot of times when you look at it in different places, and because I think the original might be in the Bargello right now, and there's like a copy uh, at Orsan Michele itself. But when you go look at the original, the lighting is like terrible, so you can't really see what the hell is going on, right?
mhm.
Which is a huge problem with sculpture. That lighting matters so much to its success. Now, I think there are ways to where you can sculpt that kind of work around that a little bit, but it's like a tricky thing that usually you don't get to control that yourself, right? You unless you know where it's going to be, which often enough you don't. Play get your work in a gallery, and they don't quite understand what's going on a lot of times. So uh, you'll get some wonky lit sculptures which
Right.
kind of can sacrifice some of those visual illusions that you refer to there.
Mhm. Yes, like speaking on galleries now, this is kind of like a sharp turn, but do you have anything to say about your experience with galleries and like submitting work, working with galleries, stuff like that?
Uh, I mean, other than that, I think it's a very very hard and difficult kind of world to attempt to enter into. Now, some people find more success probably than what I have personally, but it's it's um it's a it's a tricky world to enter into for sure, and one that if you have to sell something, if that's kind of the way that you make a living, um, you know, if you're able to do that, then that's great. I've had a hard time doing it. I've never been uh, very much like a salesman, and the one gallery that I have exhibited that I do exhibit in, it's called Stone Sparrow Gallery, and it's in New York. So in New York City, so it's like a really really good venue. It's a cool place, but sculpture is hard to sell too, and I sell things here and there, but it's not something that it's difficult to rely on, at least for me. Um, Now, Stone Sparrow does a really the woman who runs it. She's a she's an artist herself, so she does an excellent job in lighting the work, and presenting the work really really well, I think. And the gallery is like really really well put together. But I've had other experiences where I've submitted to group shows and things like this, where you come to the show to see your work, and it just has like this blaring um, like spotlight on it, and your figure has a head looking down, so you have like a bright top of the head and just like a black face, and you're just like, okay, well, that was a lot of that was you know 2 weeks worth of work sculpting a good portrait completely out the window right there because nobody can see it, and that's annoying. But that's kind of the reality of the situation. There's a lot of funny stories about that. I have he wasn't my teacher, but he was a teacher before I came to the Florence Academy. I'm not going to mention any names just in case, but he had a situation where he showed up at this gallery that he was doing a group exhibit at, and it's the opening night, and he shows up a little bit early, just to see the work and what's going on. And it's the spotlight on his sculpture doesn't work. So it's just like it's the only sculpture that doesn't have a light on it. And he's like, "What gives?" And there's like, "Yeah, that's it. Like we set up the light went out. I don't know what to do." He's like, "I'll go buy a new light for you. Like I'll run out and do it right now." And they're like, "No, nobody's allowed to mess with the lights." So I mean, I think you'll find, or anyone for that matter, will find like the there's a lot of frustration to be had
Yeah.
trying to kind of deal with that world, because you're dealing with people who are not always artists, right? So they don't really see things the way uh, that we see them. And nowadays, with social media and the opportunity to kind of advertise your own work, I think that's really like, I really think that's a good venue for most people to kind of attempt to go down, is to do your best to put your work out there on social media, build your own audience, tell your own story that way, um, and begin doing that rather sooner than later. I think, just because like that's where you're going to find the people who see your work there and who follow you or who like it or whatever. They're the people who are going to understand what you're about. And your gallerist, you know, in my scenario at least, like I've met my gallerist once. I don't have a like my work is there, but I don't. Does she thoroughly understand what the work is about? I mean, maybe she does, but I think you'll run into a scenario where a lot of times a gallery owner who's supposed to sell your work doesn't really understand your work or doesn't know what it's about, or what they understand or see about it. It's quite potentially quite surface level compared to the depth that you'll be able to, share with whoever you're talking to your work about.
Mhm.
So I think that's you know the gallery world is probably in a bit of a having a bit of some issues there. I would assume, just because of the advent of social media
Mhm.
and how useful it is for like gaining an audience that it's not it can be anywhere in the world too, which is such a bonus
Mhm.
for most of us.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit more about like your experience with social media the past couple of years?
Yeah, sure. So social media gets a lot of bad, like it gets a bad rep. I'm probably like, and I think for valid reasons. There's a lot of shit and terrible stuff going on with social media, and there's a lot of things that they do that is not so, whoever runs these things, that are not so great. And I think everyone sees that and agrees with that. I kind of I never got into MySpace. I was kind of a late adopter of Facebook, and maybe like the 2006 or 7 or something like that. So I was almost kind of past the like I feel like I dodged some bullets there, which maybe some younger people are having to kind of face with growing up with social media. I kind of was a little bit older when I started getting into it. Um, you know, f- for me, the experience is mostly positive. Most people are nice. You'll get the odd uh, troll here and there, which what they're usually they're people are having a bad day or whatever, and they're lashing out at you, and that's fine. That's fun. But for the most part, like my experience on social media is super positive. People, um, they I think they really enjoy seeing work in progress, and as long as you're kind of willing to share work in progress, which I don't really have too much of an issue with. I know some people will find that difficult, but it's like I know that work in progress looks ugly potentially, but I think there's an inroad there too, where you're kind of allowing people like a look into the essentially the reality of the world that you kind of live in, right? It's like this finished thing that you're watching that happens once every 6 months. Like I have a essentially I have a well I ha- well, I guess you could. It's not entirely true, but I have like a good day of work, like a good day at work, once every 6 months. Other than that, it's like constantly whatever I'm doing looks bad, and it looks bad until it's done. That's a bit of a rough one to deal with, and I think it's fine for people to kind of see that. I don't think it matters too much. Nobody judges you harshly based on that. Like how to do well on social media. Um, Post every day, stay consistent, answer comments, be nice to people. Share what you know. A lot of people. will get a little bit guarded with their knowledge. It's like, what's the point, you know? I for This is another thing that I think is really great about it, is that, you know, things like this can happen. Like, you can reach out to me and we can have a conversation about stuff like this. Um, it's not that long ago where that was kind of considered just like something you didn't do, you know. Like, it didn't never crossed my mind at the beginning of when I started on Instagram, maybe like 2014, 2013. You know, made the account. I didn't kind of actively pursue doing well on there or whatever, but started having an account. And at that time, like, probably, I mean, I couldn't figure out where the DM button was. There was this guy who was selling some stuff on there, I remember, and he was like, "Yeah, DM me." I was like, "What the hell does DM mean? Like, where's the button that says DM? There's no button here. What's going on?" So I had like no idea even that you could contact people. And and all and I think the power of being able to do that is that all of a sudden this like new world opens up to you, you know? Guess what? People do make a living as artists. You know, it's not that weird. They've been doing it for thousands of years and they're still doing it. Uh, People do this thing and that you want to do, and there's a path to kind of um, to walk in order to get there. And so I think for me, like, I know there's a lot of negative things about social media, but personally for me it's been a very kind of positive thing. I've always
Yeah.
enjoyed sharing and you know, I remember very vividly what it was like, um, kind of sculpting in my like dorm bedroom and like being like, is this gonna work out? I have no idea. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I need to do, and um, or where I can even look for some of those answers. Even worse, I didn't even know where to look for some of those answers. So, and that was probably just like the further back you go, the more difficult that was. So, I think the fact that those answers are so like readily available to people, I think that's a good thing. And
Mhm.
want to make sure that, well, personally, I want to make sure that kind of anyone who is in like a similar situation to me can have those answers like readily available to them.
Yeah, I definitely think you do a very good job of that, like providing this space to learn like through your process, like work in progress, and also just like kind of like a dive into your life as an artist. I've definitely benefited from that. So I think that's
Thank you.
really a neat thing to be able to connect to someone like you through social media. It's like a very powerful tool in that sort of
Yeah, I
sense.
think so.
Um, so yeah, we've been going for about an hour.
Oh wow, already.
So I guess like to wrap things up a little bit, um, do you have any last words of wisdom or maybe like book recommendations, film recommendations, anything of that sort?
Okay, so I'll do some. I wrote some things down when you sent over the questions,
Mhm.
and I figured I think it'd be a good thing since I'm like mainly, I mean, I'm an artist, but I'm also an instructor. So let me like address both, you know, the student and the my experience as a
Yeah.
professional artist. That sounds pretentious, but you know what I mean. So as like for a student, what I would suggest is to, or my words of wisdom, I guess, is to figure out what you want to get good at. Like, find a thing that you like to do and then drill down. Because the depth that exists within pretty much any field, no matter if you want to do like painting, sculpture, no matter what it is, figure, portrait, still life, landscape, no matter what it is, like the depth of knowledge that exists within that field is like it's unimaginable. And you and by drilling down, narrowing down and drilling down, I think is really the best way to get really good at something. And also recognize that it's going to take a really really long time. Patience is kind of a super important virtue, I think, as an artist. Um, you know, as I mentioned briefly, like failure, because it takes such a long time as a student, failure is like an implicit part of the life of the artist. You'll be rejected left and right. You'll fail left and right, and you just kind of have to have the grit and determination to like ignore that. You know, you have to kind of have that same naive mindset as 19-year-old Eric had when he saw Caravaggio painting and thought like, oh, that looks cool. I'll do that. That seems like a decent way to make a living. You know, you have to have almost like that mindset throughout the entire thing. Uh, where you just have to like ignore everything that happens and just forge on. Now, if you figure out what you want to get good at, find people, teachers, schools that have a track record of producing results in a similar like fashion, style, or medium, whatever it might be that you want to do, and pursue those places as best as you can. You know, if you want to make, I mean, not to kind of toot our own horn too much, but if you want to make figurative sculpture, if you want to sculpt from life and make accurate figurative sculpture, I think you'll be hard pressed to find a place that has a better track record than the Florence Academy of Art. It's going to be difficult to find a place that has more years of good results, just year after year after year. So if you find a place like that that does what you want and does what you like, then that's probably a decent place to go to school. They have a track record of success, and that track record I think is very important because that says something about what they teach. So it's not like some random Joe Schmo came through there and he was like the next Leonardo da Vinci and knocked it out of the park, and now he's making millions. But if you have like 15 years worth of results, well, that means that you're teaching something that works. And so looking for that is really, really, I think, a good thing to be doing as a student once you kind of figure out what you want to do, right? In regards to being like a professional artist, I think if you're not genuine and do essentially make what you want to make, if you're trying to cater to an audience, I think that'll come across very quickly. People see through that. So, and that's where, again, social media comes in. You might think that your interests are really unique. I think most of us figure out pretty quickly that our interests are not that unique. A lot of people are interested in similar things. And you can build an audience based on what it is that you like. And if you can do that, I think that's kind of like, then you get your people. Then you have people who are interested in the same thing as you, and that is your audience. Those are the people that you should be catering to, or looking to find, essentially. It's a little bit like, are you finding your friends based on, are you finding your friends based on like similar interests and stuff like that? Or are you finding your friends based on like what their last name is and their position in society or something like that? And so, yeah, that would be and that's also a much more, I think, sustainable approach. Both from like keeping your passion and interest in the work which you need in order to kind of be able to do it at a high level. And especially nowadays, you can do that because of, you don't need anybody but like a social media account, essentially. You just need yourself and a little bit of hard work, and you can find like your people and your audience. I hope you enjoyed the interview and perhaps learned a thing or two. Maybe not about sculpture, but perhaps about me, if nothing else. Something that can be useful to you in the future. Until next time and next week, stay creative.